Life Management Science Labs would like to acknowledge that we live and produce this podcast on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people. We'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands of our listeners and our international colleagues. We'd like to thank and pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Hi everyone, and welcome to On the House, the Household Management Science Insights podcast produced by LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. We are champions of life management science, providing structured insights informed by science and inspired by practice on key aspects of conscious living. Each week we bring you scientific and practical insights on each element with the expert knowledge of professionals in the field. I'm your host, Gabriella Joustra, coming to you from Naarm, Melbourne, Australia. Let's begin. Hi everyone, and welcome back to the show. Today we're going to be talking about the calm in the chaos, navigating household emergencies. And we're talking to Erich Wolff, who is a postdoctoral research fellow at Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. He's working to understand and respond to floods by partnering with local communities. Hi, thank you for joining me.
Hello, Gabriella. Thank you for having me on the show. Great pleasure.
Thank you. Do you mind introducing yourself in a bit more detail so we get to know you?
Yes, so I think there's some interesting things about me. First of all, I'm originally from Brazil. So I came from the other side of the planet, and then I did my PhD at Monash University in Melbourne. But my main case studies were the Asia-Pacific region. And then after my PhD, I moved to Singapore, and I have been working in climate adaptation, particularly in Southeast Asia right now. I've done work in Fiji, I've done work in Australia, done work in Indonesia and Thailand, and a little bit in Singapore, obviously. But yes, I think my passions are floods, are connecting with people and talking about climate change, talking about preparations, how we can act and how we can adapt. I think there's a lot to unpack there, but I'll leave it for the interview.
Yes, thank you. I'm looking forward to this. I think there are so many things that we can learn from you, and you're so well traveled. Did you like Melbourne?
I love Melbourne, and you never know. An academic life always has a lot of back and forth. You move a lot around, but I find it very likely that I'll go back to Melbourne at some point.
Yeah, I love Melbourne. But we'd also like to get to know you in a bit more detail with the section we call Have You Met Erich? So we'd like to know, first of all, what is your favorite book?
Well, that's the thing. I think in an academic job, we end up reading a lot for work. So I think it's been a little while that I haven't read for fun fully. But I would say that some of the things that I used to read that I loved for fun, particularly at a younger age, were those detective stories. And I think that I was very into Sherlock Holmes and Agatha Christie, and Agatha Christie is like Miss Marple, I think the character. So I think like Murder and the Orient Express, for example, would be one of my favorite books, at least that I remember reading and rereading it again. I think that magic of wanting to know what happens next, I think, and wanting to solve the mystery, which in some sense, maybe it's a science thing as well, right?
That's true. I haven't thought about, whodunits as a science thing, but it does make sense.
Yeah. Well, I think I definitely had a lot of fun reading these things.
I've got to admit, I never really got into, I think I tried reading Agatha Christie once. I found it very hard, but I also think I might have been 11.
I think you could give it another go. It's quite approachable. It's not every book, definitely. There's Arthur Conan Doyle and Agatha Christie. They're very prolific. They wrote a lot. So start with the good ones, but they're amazing ones. Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah.
And have you had time to watch any movies recently?
Probably the answer you're getting a lot now is Barbenheimer, right? Barbie and Oppenheimer. I'll probably focus on maybe not Oppenheimer, but I think Christopher Nolan movies are some of my favorites. I think that's a bit of a cliche for scientists as well. Inception, Interstellar, and now Oppenheimer, I think they are fantastic movies. Maybe what I like about them is the fact that they're inspired in science or inspired in scientific discussions, but made it very approachable. And yeah, you can make people think about, well, Interstellar, for example, can you think about what would it mean for space and time to be something you could cross again, right? Which we know is part of Einstein's theory, but I find it really interesting when it's made in the movie and people can relate to it, or people can, I think, abstract and explore that idea in a visual way. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And maybe it'll inspire someone to actually create the technology to do it one day.
Yes, exactly. I think these movies that can connect us to important scientific or philosophical discussions. There's Her as well, that is coming a lot now in the discussions because of artificial intelligence and how we relate to it, and that fear that humans will fall in love with their computers or with the artificial intelligence in general. I find those things fascinating. I think Her is a bit of a slow movie, so I don't like the pace, but I love the idea.
Yeah. And I think that with Her, it feels it feels like it could just be like in the next 10 years that could happen. Yeah. Whereas maybe Interstellar, maybe a bit more time.
Yeah, who knows? It talks about an apocalyptic future, right? That people need to travel out of the planet because the planet is wrecked. So I think if anything, if it makes us think about the value of saving our planet, I think it's already right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And do you listen to any podcasts?
Yes, I do. Maybe the one I would refer to right now, I would recommend the audience, is they're actually not super active, but it's I really love it. It's called Eons, and it's by PBS in the US. So it's a not-for-profit organization, PBS. And it's basically, they have a YouTube channel and they upload videos, short videos. Always they are related to like paleontology or archaeology. But they are based on real research, and they're like 10-minute videos usually. And they did a podcast last year. I think the last one was mid last year. And I think the podcast is called Ian's Mysteries of Deep Time. And it's this kind of thing that probably what I like about it is because it's about science and about, well, they're talking about Neanderthals all the time or about dinosaurs. I definitely was a dinosaur child, but I think it's beyond that. It brings the discussion to today. Why does that matter? Mm-hmm. And like understanding how our planet changed or understanding our behavior. Why are we here? And how did we survive ice ages? Or how did we cooperate? And what is the first evidence of a human helping another human? Those are all topics that they cover. And I think I highly recommend it as, again, probably scientific research made accessible and made relevant and made into something that people can engage with.
Great. How do you spell that? Eons,
EONS. Yeah, it's I think a geological term as well. It's
okay. I think I was thinking of it like the rest of the word science, but just ions.
No, Eons. It's EONS. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Thank you. I think that'll make it a lot easier for everyone to find it.
Yes. Sorry for
or maybe
the
just
confusion.
Me. That's okay. And do you have a role model?
Yes. I think the obvious answer is a parent. Right? I think my parents, I have no siblings, so definitely very connected with my parents. But besides that, I think I have professional role models as well that are very important for me. I think I'm very lucky that my current mentor, my current boss, I prefer to call her a mentor, is someone I aspire to be academically and professionally. I think I work with Assistant Professor Perrine Hamel here in Singapore, and I've told her many times, the reason I came to Singapore to a large extent is because I wanted to work with her. I think I really admire how generous she is and how I think cognizant of different backgrounds and open opportunities. I think women in academia have a hard time very often to, I think, align academia with maternity. And I think we should always be championing that there are more women in academia. And yeah, even though I'm not a woman, I think certainly when I Googled her name and I saw that she was championing this, it's the kind of mentor I would like to work with. It's really important for me, seeing how the dynamics in our group work, how our PhD students are all empowered to have their voice, and how she never would say, I'm too busy to discuss your career progression, for example. I think those are all very important things for me, and that I'm sure that I will be doing in the future. I know I've had a lot of academic mentors. So I think, I have to thank all the people who brought me to where I am and all the people I'll continue working in the future. But I think being generous and opening space for the next generation is something that it's definitely differential for me.
She sounds like an amazing mentor. And it sounds like, you've been very lucky to have such a number of great mentors.
Yes, definitely have. I think academia, no one is a good academic alone. Mm-hmm. It's a community.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. And our last question is, have you completed any courses that have inspired you?
Yes. So I think the first thing that I can think of is maybe about another teacher who she was my teacher when I was back in Brazil. I was an undergrad student, and I have a background in civil engineering and architecture. But I remember, I think it was my first or second semester at university, and it was Introduction to Geology. And for some reason, I think there was a problem with enrollment, and all my classmates did in the civil engineering classroom, and I didn't get a room in that with that group. So I had to be moved to the geology group. So it's like hardcore geology, right? Introduction to Geology in the geology department.
Oh.
And this professor, we were terrified of her. She was an elderly woman, looked very frail, but people were terrified because she failed a lot of students. She was high expert in the field. I just remember that what I loved about her is that I would talk to my colleagues in the civil engineering group, and their teacher was just a lazy guy. And they hear like the test questions, everybody knew, it's chapter 10, page 100, the third paragraph, that's the answer to the question. You just know that and you figure the test. And for her, I remember getting to the first test, not knowing what would happen. She got a bag of rocks and put it in front of me and say, classify. And it was like, I think it was mind blowing. But on the other hand, it was like knowledge made tangible, right? Mm-hmm. You can apply it. So now I can walk down the street, get a rock, and I can classify it. And my friends, they had no clue because the other teacher was just asking them to repeat what was in the book. So I think it definitely influenced my interest in geology, but I don't work with geology right now. I think I work with natural sciences more general, but it also influenced me in how I like to teach as well. Yeah, how I like to talk about science, I guess.
Yeah, I think that, in universities, I certainly experienced this. They want to get you in and out, having learned everything, pass all the tests, and it doesn't matter if you actually remember anything that you learned. And I think that maybe is a bit of a problem. So it's good to hear that, you're applying, the fact that, you really actually learned something, and that it's really important to actually not just pass a test, but learn the materials.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, that aspect of making it tangible, having experience with it, I think that's that was life-changing for me. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
So I like to start the podcast by, defining a few things so that we're starting off on the same foot. So how do you define household management?
That's a really good question. It is interesting because it brought me memories from a few months ago. I was in this academic workshop, and there's this young guy. He's a colleague, an early career researcher, as we call as well. But I think he's a more old school type of academic. And he started a meeting by defining management. And I said, well, that sounds a little bit antiquated, but then I heard it and I was like, wow, that's actually super interesting. I'm going to use it sooner or later. So shout out for Z for the telling me the etymology of management that I'm going to use now. I think I've found it really interesting because management, it's actually comes from Old French or Old Latin. And the root of it is the same root of the word hence in most Latin languages. So it comes manus, which is derived to get to management. So the whole original idea of management was a word used to talk about taming wild horses. So I find it fascinating how management is in some ways about taming uncertainty and taming chaos to get to something that we consider productive. So yeah, household management, in some ways, we could refer back to the original etymology and say, how can we put order to chaos? I don't like the word order, but it's like, how can we tame it and make it manageable as we're humans, right? We need to manage things. We need to simplify complexity so we can deal with it, I guess.
I love that definition. It's quite different from like everything I've gotten before, but it definitely, I think most people find their houses quite chaotic, and everyone sort of longs for that order or, knowing where everything is. And so I love that definition. And actually, today we're going to be talking about the calm in the chaos. So I do want to know, what is a disaster? And what is a natural disaster?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. First of all, maybe before I answer your question, Gabriella, I think it's important that we do a little disclaimer, just because we are going to talk about several different topics, I think, and I'm obviously not an expert in everything. So, and besides that, I think there are some topics we're talking about life-threatening situations. So obviously it's important that we do a disclaimer that this is an informal discussion. It's meant to be informative, but people should not take this as an expert advice, and they should not make life-changing decisions based on this podcast. The obvious recommendation is always follow the instruction for your local authorities. If you feel there's a situation that could be threatening your life, you should look for professional accredited advice wherever you are. Right. Having said that, I think we can go to our discussion. Disaster is a really interesting word. In academia, there's a lot of debate about disasters. But I think some of the best authors, in my opinion, try to make it as simple as possible, this definition. And what you would say is a disaster is when you have a situation that is so bad that you require external help to deal with it. Mm-hmm. So it is as generic as that. Obviously, we could unpack a lot of these terms. What is to deal with it? What is external help? And what is the situation, right? So, I mean, we could do a whole course on this, but to make it shorter, usually what we're talking about is what people traditionally or historically have called a natural disaster. Mm-hmm. And when we were preparing for the podcast, I told you that I had problems with that terminology. It's, I think, and I think it's not obvious, right? What did you think when he told you that I had a problem with it?
Well, so I was like, I was like, oh, we've always called, well, as far as I'm aware, we've always called them natural disasters because, it happens in nature and it's a disaster. So I was like, okay. And I did want to ask this question because I think that a lot of people have the same misconception as I did. And I'd love for everyone to learn as well why we shouldn't be calling them natural disasters.
Yeah. So I think that's exactly the point. Yeah. I think the idea is obviously we recognize that the origin of many of these things, we're talking about like earthquakes or tsunamis or floods or storms, we recognize there is an environmental component, right? We prefer environmental than natural, for example. But the thing is, the danger of calling natural disasters is when a decision maker, for example, government or someone with power, says, oh, sorry, this earthquake killed a lot of people. It was a natural disaster, because it removes the responsibility. I think it blames nature. It's very easy to blame nature and say that, oh, we couldn't have predicted it, or we couldn't have done anything. And what the community actually says, and there's a very interesting and big movement around this in the disaster scientists community. If you look for it, it's hashtag no natural disasters. And what they say is, sure, there could be an environmental origin, but we can do something about everything, right? Even if we're talking about earthquakes, we can build better buildings. If we're talking about floods, we could not be settling in a floodplain, right? And that's obviously, it shouldn't be misinterpreted as I'm blaming the people who got caught in the flood. That's not it. We should be making accountable the authorities, for example, that allowed people to purchase land on the floodplain, right? Mm-hmm. Or the ones who didn't set up an early warning system or who didn't educate people. So yeah, I think we can unpack more in the other questions, but that's the main reason why we avoid it, is so that we held people responsible. And yeah, I think that's the main reason. We don't want to be rude to people and say, stop using that totally. But it's like, particularly the push is asking journalists to stop mainstreaming that term and saying, no, it's a disaster which has a very big human component. Human decisions made a difference in how it played out. So we need to make humans accountable, or at least aware that they should better prepare for next time.
And it does. I was thinking, maybe this is because, I've grown up since then, but I feel like, 10 years ago, natural disaster, oh, what could you have done? There wasn't anything we could have done to prevent this. I feel like now there's a lot more, well, we should have done this, we should have done that to prepare for it. Why? I think it's also because we have a lot more disasters nowadays because of reasons I think we'll get into. Instead of saying, oh, it's so surprising that this place is flooded, instead saying, well, this happened last year and this is going to happen next year. Maybe we should start doing something to move people away from this area or something to stop the flooding, something bigger. Yeah.
I agree with you. And I think what I would say is definitely the terminology aspect. And we grew up hearing people talking natural disasters, right? So it's hard to get out of it. And I might even slip sometimes and say it, but I then immediately no, we cannot say natural disasters. I work in this field and we need to make sure that people know that something can be done. I think maybe another way of illustrating this is thinking about, there's this professor that I really like in the UK. His name is Ian Kelman. He's a professor at the University College London. And he has an amazing book called Disasters by Choice. Well, by the name of the book, that's one of the big points, right? But I love that always when he does his lectures, he uses this example. I think it's a tricky question. It's like, and I can try it on you. How many people died as a consequence of an earthquake. It's like, and then he asked people to estimate it. What do you think? Like in the last year, how many people died due to an earthquake?
I can't really think of, I mean, maybe I'm just not paying attention to the news, but I'm trying to think
the
of how many
magnitude.
earthquakes.
Yeah.
I don't know, like 200 people?
Yeah. Well, the tricky question is that the answer is zero. No one dies from an earthquake. People die from collapsing buildings. An earthquake happens, the shakes. So that's a distinction that maybe we'll get next. It's an earthquake is a hazard. It's a situation that has a potential to cause damage, but it only causes damage due to human action or inaction. So if we actually had everybody lived, if there's an earthquake in the middle of the sea, no one is affected. The earthquake needs to happen in a city, and particularly in a city with poorly built buildings. And that's when casualties happen. So, and I think this was even illustrated in, I think this year, right? It was in February. There was the big earthquake in Turkey. I saw it went a bit viral, at least in the disaster studies community. It went a bit viral that they had a photo of the city completely destroyed with one building standing, and it was the Engineers Association. Because obviously the engineers built it really well. And they found out that a lot of the responsibility for the immense number of deaths in this earthquake particularly was poor regulations. The government had simplified building codes to encourage development, and then developers are not charity, right? They want to maximize their profit. So they made cheap buildings to sell more and to produce more. And then the buildings could not stand an earthquake. So, yeah.
So whose responsibility is it to make sure that, for each area, everyone knows what the main hazards are and develops ways to, make sure that, it doesn't affect people or it doesn't, kill people?
Yeah. So I think my answer is everybody should be responsible. It should be a shared responsibility, in the sense that it's something of common interest, right? It's in the society's interest to avoid disasters. So everybody should be aware. Obviously, the whole idea of a government is, if you look at the origin of the word and of the concept, the idea is that people alone cannot build a bridge to cross a river. You need to collaborate with others. So the origin of government is the idea that people can make shared decisions of common interest, and they can mobilize resources and they can organize themselves. And so the government is the ultimate body that represents the will of the people and the shared responsibilities and the shared interests. So yes, it's very easy to say that the government should be doing more. Always, the authorities are responsible for the well-being and the physical and mental integrity of the citizens. But I think we can talk about how even an individual has a responsibility of being aware of your surroundings and your home and where you live and what could affect you. So I think we can unpack that more.
Great, yes. So I guess obviously if you have a government that's coming up saying, we will do everything to make sure that, your buildings are safe and we'll protect you from floods and everything, or we're going to vote more environmentally friendly policies, then that's something that we should do. But, as far as right now, what can we do to protect our homes? We need to look at that as well. Yeah, okay. So I guess first of all, how do we know what we should be looking for when we're, moving into an area or already living in an area? How do we know what we should be prepared for?
Yeah, there is no straightforward answer. I would love to refer to, and maybe there is, I'm just not aware of a checklist. Check for all these hazards where you live. Maybe it exists, but I think one of the challenges of contemporary life, right, is that we're so busy and we have so many concerns, and well, we need to work and we need to think about career progression and family, and there are responsibilities. So I think the very important and the basic answer I have for this is be aware of your surroundings. And I think humanity, we used to be very cognizant of the environment around us, right? And if you look at indigenous communities, they are historically much more connected to nature. And there is a knowledge about nature that is shared from generation to generation. So indigenous people are very good, and particularly in Australia with the longest living culture. There are stories, there is a legacy of knowledge being passed from generation to generation about what happened in the past and about what could happen in this place where we live, right? So I think this is something that unfortunately we lose a lot. And well, I can definitely talk about that as being a migrant who lived for a while in Australia, now living for a while in Singapore. Every time I move, it's obviously a new culture and a new city to navigate, but we also don't know the things around us. And I think looking for this knowledge is super important. Maybe just when you're moving in, talk to your elderly neighbors who have been there. Was ever there a flood before, and how bad was it? And I don't know, you could definitely just being aware and being more grounded. I think it's a very good suggestion, but maybe that is a bit I'm going almost in a spiritual way. Obviously, you could look for what our authorities recommend. The official guidance in Australia, what I can say, where I imagine most of the audience could be, is you look for your local councils. Local councils have maps of hazards. They know how likely it is to flood, how likely it is for a landslide to happen or for a fire to happen. So I think, particularly a large portion of the risk management in a household should be done when you're purchasing a property, right?
Yeah. So, once you've discovered, this house is more at risk of floods, or, maybe we get really strong storms one time of year. Once you know what's going to happen, what kinds of things can you do to prepare for them? Or even to reduce the risk?
Yes. Maybe what we're getting to is risk management. That's a good opportunity to just say what risk management is and how we could do it, right? So I think risk management, the whole idea is you need to, first of all, identify these hazards, as we were talking about. And then risk as an academic concept, I'm going to try to make it as simple as possible, I promise, is a combination of how likely it is that something will happen. So a probability, a chance of something happening. And then how bad are the consequences? So these are the two components that interact. Academics love complicating this, obviously. So there's you could talk about exposure, you could talk about vulnerability, but they are kind of within these two realms. So I think always what you should be aware is what are the chances of it happening? And then how bad would it be if it happens? And then risk management is reducing these two, or one of them, whichever you can. Usually whichever is cheaper and easier to reduce. So what you can do is, maybe one way is thinking about the scenarios. So if you have a house that you know is likely to flood, can you think about the scenarios? What is 30 centimeters high flood? what is a 1 meter high flood and what is a 3 meter high flood. So these are scenarios, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you can play with that. And ideally, you would be able even to look with your local authorities how likely it is that each of these scenarios happen.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe the 30 centimeter one happens every rainy season a couple of times. Maybe the 1 meter one happened once in the history of the site, in the known history of the site. And maybe the 3 meter one never happened. But, it's always good to have that scenario in mind, right? So once you have the scenarios, then it's time to think about how do you reduce the chances and how do you reduce the consequences, right? Maybe I can ask back to you, what do you think we could do to reduce the chances, for example?
For a flood, you could build higher. You could build on a hill. You could build on stilts. Build a barrier to stop the water from getting in.
Yes. And it's really interesting because all your answers are going to very physical things, right?
Yeah.
Which makes sense because a flood is a physical thing, right? It's a water coming in, so get out of the water. I think that's a very obvious answer, a great answer. What I would say is very often the reducing the consequences, then it gets a bit more nuanced and it's usually less physical. Because how can you reduce the impact of a flood? First of all, know the number of the emergency services, right? So have it very easily accessible so that you can ask for help. Another possible strategy is, thinking about the consequences of getting your house flooded. I can talk about maybe my experience with working in Indonesia in very flood-prone communities. What people, it's unfortunate. We should not glamorize it because obviously it's very often people are in need and they settle in flood-prone areas because land is more affordable, obviously, right? No one wants to live there, so it's cheaper. And then what happens is people get used to regular flooding. And what they do is they found very ingenious ways of reducing the damage caused. One of them is, for example, you're buying a couch. Don't buy a couch made of fabric. Maybe buy a plastic seats. Plastic seats can be wet and then they dry and then done, right? Mm-hmm. So you've reduced cost of damaged furniture. If you look for, it's actually not very different what people do and what you look in what Venice does. Venice has historically dealt with floods. Very often people have 2-story houses, not because they're fancy or because they're nicer, but it's a risk management strategy. If you have a second floor, you can keep less valuable things on the ground floor. You can keep activities on the ground floor. You can host your friends, but your valuables, your TV, your computer, you keep on the second floor. And you that's kind of a strategy of allowing it to flood. And it is interesting discussing these things because it's also very cultural, right? If you talk about people in Australia living with floods, I know that in Queensland, there's a history of houses on stilts. But if you talk in Melbourne about people in central Melbourne living with floods, people are not into it, right? And there will be a big resistance to that. But I think we should be aware of these things and they are valid strategies. So maybe with a future that is uncertain, we could be considering more of those things and not just building more walls and more walls.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting because I guess, I'm just like, stop the water, don't let the water come in. And you're like, water is what's going to happen. Just, I guess, have strategies to deal with the water as it comes in. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's obviously not easy to swallow that pill, right? If you're living in a city center and you don't want to hear about your house getting flooded. but maybe at least not taking to the extreme that everybody should have it. But if you know your area is very flood prone, maybe adopt it partially at least. Maybe at least if you're going to buy something very valuable, buy something that is not heavy, that you can move with you when the flood is coming, right? Don't buy the most expensive couch that is super heavy and you cannot move it alone, right? Or if you do, put it on the second floor. So I think those are basic things that maybe people don't want to hear it, but after the flood comes, that makes a difference.
And it's not so hard, I think, to think I'm just going to put my nice sofa on the top floor and I'll keep my slightly older sofa on the bottom floor.
Yeah. And that's risk management. Yeah. It's better to do it before than to, I could have thought about that, right? Later, once the damage is caused. Yeah.
And so how does resilience play a role in preparing and responding to these emergencies?
Resilience is a very interesting concept as well. It's quite controversial. There's a big history. I'm not going to go into all of it, but it has a mix of, it is a big concept in psychology. It is a big concept in ecology and in physics. So it's like you can talk about resilience of a material, like a resilience of a road to car traffic, while you can talk about mental resilience in the workplace. And so it goes everywhere, right? What usually we think about resilience, I think most people, if you ask around, like people who don't study this, people very often think it is about resisting as well, and being strong, right? I think that's what people would think. I think it's more productive to think about resilience, and it's a bit in the academic way of treating this concept is about how well can you recover after the damage is caused. So the idea is, well, some of these things that we were talking are about resilience already, right? If you can reduce the damage, right? That's resilience. One of the strategies, the resilience strategies, there was a whole literature, books and books on this, but you could think about resilience to a flood. It could be about building a fortress, building walls, as you said, but it could be about just dealing with it and like allowing water to come in and not have valuables on the ground floor. Or it could be about, I think it less applicable to houses, but you can think that there are many indigenous strategies of dealing with fire and with floods that are about just let it go, produce something cheap and simple and easy. When the flood comes, it's okay. You expected it would happen at some time. You just rebuild it. So I think those are strategies of, if it is easy to rebuild, it's resilient. If it is sturdy and not affected, it's also resilient. But also there is the in-between of anything that is, anything that would allow you to reduce damage and recover more quickly. So again, in the sense that if you can recover quickly and easily, then resilience is the antidote of disasters, right? As disaster is when you need external help because you cannot deal with it alone, resilience is the opposite of it, is making sure you can deal with it alone or making sure that you have the strategies. So yeah, I think so many things can be resilience, but going back to, for example, communities who coexist with floods, you can think about stocking food as a resilience strategy, right? And even having savings for a need. And that's very applicable in household management anywhere, right? Have those savings that they are there in case you lose your job, in case there's a massive pandemic that a lot of people lose their jobs. And yeah, I think resilience can have all these strategies. I still don't understand why in Australia, particularly when the pandemic arrived, people ran to buy toilet paper I think that was a curious priority. But maybe it talks about, what people in their worst nightmares is running out of toilet paper for some reason. But I think in Indonesia, in those flood-prone communities, a lot of it was storing food that is not perishable food, right? Because the main hazard, actually, as I said, the houses are very prepared already. People have lived with it for years. So their main threat is actually being disconnected from the city. The roads flood and you cannot move around. So how you reduce the damage is by having everything you need at home. Yeah, I think I went into a tangent, but I think those are many examples of resilience there.
Yeah. No, thank you. I think that's really good to remember that it's not just about, maybe preparing your home to either protect yourself from disasters or hazards, or, prepare the house in such a way that you're not as affected, but also making sure that you are able to recover and to survive the hazard itself. But what about, after the hazard, so your house has been flooded and, everything survived, you've got enough food, but how do you recover from that afterwards? Do you have any recommendations?
Yeah, I think that again probably goes at the individual level, but it also is a community level effort, right? And again, we're talking about resilience indirectly there because we're talking about how quickly or easily you can return to a functional state and to not normalcy, because things evolve, as we've seen with COVID, right? It's a new normal, but it's returning to a functional state is a challenge, and it should be something that we are all aware and authorities are aware as well. I think in the case of Australia, for example, if we talk about the big fire season, right? The Black Summer in Australia, 2019 to 2020. I was in Australia at the time, and unfortunately, a lot of people were affected. A lot of people lost their homes. And I think that the recovery was very hard. There was some pushback at the time, even of people getting into the news and saying, hey, our house is burnt. What do we do now? No one is coming to help us. So I think a lot of it is about having a contingency plan beforehand. And as we were saying, for example, in a case of a fire, of a flood, you should immediately know the number of emergency services and those things that are useful during, but afterwards, it is a community effort, really. So it's about, you should probably have your savings for the emergency. That certainly improves your recovery. But very often is about, if it is a disaster, you need your community, you need your government. So the people should be advocating or asking for the government to have these plans for recovery, for people to be supported and to have, particularly if we're seeing an increasing amount of things happening, there should be a community-wide strategy. There could be, in the same way that we have like community watch, we could have community recovery. And we see this in Southeast Asia, in other countries. In Fiji, I saw that was very strong, the community component of it. People move into someone else's home until they can recover and their home can again be in a livable condition, right? You cannot do many of the rebuilding works cannot be done while you're living in the place. So unfortunately, in the afterwards, it comes a lot to social capital, community bonds, governmental support, and having a contingency plan, right? Having thought about those things beforehand. I'm not advocating for everyone to become those extreme, what they call the doomsday preppers, right? the survivalists that we see, those people who build bunkers and who store a lot of stuff. I think that is a very extreme, and sure, it comes to an individual choice of what is your tolerance to risk. If you have a very, very low tolerance, if you think there is a nuclear warfare coming your way, yeah, then maybe it's probably a very good idea. But currently, I don't think we are seeing that threat looming so closely. So I think that is an extreme case, but maybe you can have a bit of that, right? You can think about how do you protect your family and how do you have the resources to rebuild afterwards. Yeah.
You mentioned as well, I think in your email, that you wanted to talk about how disasters affect people differently depending on I guess, where they're living or socioeconomic status. Do you want to talk about that still? Yeah. Okay. Cool. Great. I'll ask a question. So you mentioned before, how in Turkey, because of the building codes, most of the city was, decimated. It was, but compare it to somewhere like Japan, where I was there during an earthquake. I barely felt it, and I feel like Japan is very built up for earthquakes. So I'm assuming something like an earthquake or other disasters like flooding would be affected depending on the people would be affected by how the buildings are created. So I'm assuming then that some people are affected more by disasters than other people.
Definitely, yeah. And I think that to some extent is what I was thinking also when we were preparing for the podcast. We were talking about how the household can prepare for it. But I was also talking about, we need to have a broader discussion as well as about the collective, right? As I said, the whole idea that having a community is essential to recover. And that's probably one of the big issues I have with the doomsday preppers is that it's usually very individualistic, right? The idea, I think, is we as a society should be thinking together about how everyone is going through a disaster, right? We've seen during the pandemic, if you had a good job, that you had stability and you had a good salary and you had savings and you lived in a comfortable large house, actually being in a lockdown doesn't affect you as much. But if you are living in an overcrowded house, if you are an immigrant who doesn't have a stable job, if you are a student or a young person who has the needs to be with kids, right? And to have that social as part of your growing process, as part of your development, you were much more affected. So you could think about how the pandemic affected differently someone with a large house, who is a homeowner, who has a stability, and someone who is an immigrant and have a stable, a non-stable job or insecurity in terms of income, in terms of housing condition. So I think that's a great example of how different people are affected. But that is talking about a pandemic that is a prolonged disaster, that we had time to act throughout it. The government did actions and reevaluated the actions and had weekly revisions, right? What about a disaster that happens? We say that every disaster is a continuous disaster, but what about something that has a very big disruption in one moment, an earthquake? There is a lot of research, for example, and I've seen on my work as well in the Asia Pacific, but there's a lot of research for example, in the aftermath of an earthquake, how women are disproportionately affected because you are pushed out of your home very often, right? If the house is not in a habitable condition, you need to move into a refuge. It's like, I don't know, like a school or a church, and they welcome a lot of people who lost their homes. And in these conditions, some people feel particularly vulnerable. So there are multiple cases of sexual harassment, of crime, in these conditions, in a refugee camp, in a place where people are seeking shelter. So it is very complicated. You need to have the policy, and the authorities need to have the contingency plan, even to think about how different people are differently affected, right? I think there's a lot of research as well about people fleeing wars. Particularly there was the Syria war, there was the war in Afghanistan, all those wars, particularly in some countries, LGBTQI plus people in a refugee camp, they don't feel comfortable because there's no spaces for them, because they are safe in some contexts, they are only safe inside their homes. When they are removed from their homes, they're particularly vulnerable. So we need to think about, as a society, how different people are affected and how we should advocate for treatment that can recognize these differences and that can help people based on how much they're affected. I think that's essential in discussing disasters as a collective issue. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I haven't thought that much about it, because I think, when I see these things happening, I'm just like, if it's far away from me, I'm like, oh, that's sad. If it's close to me, I'm like, oh, I guess I still say, oh, that's sad. And I don't put much thought into it until it's me it's happening to. So is there anything that we can do other than advocating, in these situations, or is it just bringing attention to this? Is that the only thing we can do?
I think we can educate ourselves, right? As we were discussing, being aware of your environment. I think there is a level that is advocacy at the government level. We should request the government to do more. But I think there is also a potential for mobilization at the local scale, right? And we see a lot of these communities who deal with floods regularly. They organize themselves, the church group, the school group. People have created their local networks, their local safety mechanisms as well. I think those are very important in terms of how we can prepare ourselves, not in the individual level, not in the government level, but in the mid-scale. Knowing your neighbors very well. And being able to work with them. I know in the cases of fires and floods, I think that's very obvious, right? I'm certainly not an expert in fires, so don't quote me on anything, but there are the strategies of doing land clearing to stop fires. And one person doing it alone doesn't help. But if you can mobilize a community and everybody goes and does, well, there's a fire coming, let's clear this area, so that creates a buffer for the fire, slows it down. I think the research says that usually the first response is your neighbor. So I don't want it to just be in the cliche discussion, the government should do more, because everybody says that. We all wanted the government to do more. But I think we can have responsibility, at least in the local level, because that's what happens. In the case of a flood, a fire, an earthquake, usually your neighbor is your first help. So having those bonds, which nowadays are very hard to make, it's important, right? Strong communities are resilient communities.
And I guess knowing that, there are people in your community who will be more vulnerable, and keeping an eye out for them so you can provide that extra support to them, and not just assuming that they'll be fine because you're also fine.
Exactly. Yeah, I think in Indonesia, I heard a lot of people that counted on family obviously. But, and yeah, it's like the flood is coming, weather, the weather bureau told us we should bulk for an incoming flood. I heard in a lot of interviews, people said the first thing is I go to my elderly neighbor and say, do you need help moving your things upstairs before moving mine? Because I know I can do it. In the neighbor, being aware of the solidarity as well, and being aware of people around you and their different needs. I think that's essential. Yeah, that's building community. So important.
Thank you for reminding me. I need to talk to my neighbors.
Yeah, particularly if you live in a flood-prone area, or the situations is essential.
And is there anything else that you want to touch on before we move on to our next section?
I don't think anything specifically comes to my mind. I think we can move on.
Yeah,
probably.
Okay, good. We are running a bit over time, so I think what we might do is we'll do the practice and habits section, and I think we'll have to skip the questions from the audience in the open mic. Is that okay with you? Yeah. Okay. So we're going to move on to the practice and habits section now. So what is a practice that you do to prepare or prevent disasters in your own life?
Yeah, the first thing that comes to my mind really is something being an academic, is when we see how bigger institutions do risk management. And universities are very good at it. Universities in Australia particularly are very risk averse. So I've learned a lot from even doing risk management for an university activity. And maybe that's a good example that we could build on when you're taking students, for example, to fieldwork. And I think it applies directly if you're planning a road trip with your family. That is a very similar situation. And maybe if you're listening to us and thinking about your next road trip, think about these steps, how a university would deal with a road trip. There's basically a whole risk management framework that is put in place, as we discussed before, to think about what are the chances of something happening and how big is the potential consequence. And then, do we tolerate this risk, or are we acting on it to reduce it? Right? I think that's my immediate answer to how I would do it.
Do you have any examples of a time when you have done this?
Yes. So I think it's mostly, when you're taking students out for a road trip for a fieldwork, right? And maybe thinking about your next road trip, you can think of, first thing you suggested, how you're going there. If you're going by car, then it's always recommended, for example, to go and take your car to be reviewed, right? Mm-hmm. To see if it is working properly. And when you're thinking about that, for example, when you ask a specialist to look at your engine and brakes, what you're talking there is about reducing the likelihood that something will go wrong, right? Because if your brakes are not working, that's probably one of the, I'm not expert on cars again, but that's probably one of the leading causes for road accidents by malfunctioning the brakes or engine or something like that. So you have someone to look at it, they're in good condition, you've drastically reduced your chances of something bad happening, right? So that's risk management. On the other side, you ask someone to look at you check if your seatbelts are in good condition, if your airbag is in good condition. Those are not reducing the chance that the thing happens, but they're reducing the damage to you. Mm-hmm. If your airbags are working well, then you know that you're much more protected, right? So again, it's all the things we're doing there are already risk management, but you can put that lens, and instead of just having a checklist, it's like, what are the things that I can do? First, what are the threats? This road trip I'm doing, what are the hazards, right? It could be a car crash. It could be running out of petrol in the middle of nowhere if you're going very far, if you're going to Perth, from Melbourne to Perth. That is a very reasonable hazard. So I think just identifying those scenarios is a very good start. And from there, how do you reduce the chance of something happening? Reducing the chance of a car crash is, for example, checking your brakes. Reducing the chance of running out of petrol, well, maybe it's just planning beforehand where all the petrol stations are, right? That is a very important thing that you should do beforehand if you want to reduce. You identify that as a significant hazard. You want to reduce the chance of that becoming a disaster, right? You want to create the barrier between the hazard and disaster. Make a map of all the petrol stations beforehand. Maybe Google Maps is outdated and you're counting on it and the petrol station is closed and done, right? Mm-hmm. So I think that those are examples.
Great. Yeah, thank you. Perfect. Yeah, I think that was all. Did you want to say anything else with the practice and habit section? I think you've covered most of the things here, but...
Yeah, I think so. But yeah, I mean, some other examples that the university always asks us to think about that maybe could inspire people is whenever I'm taking students out, the university always has those basic questions. How are you going? If you're going by boat, that increases your chances of something going wrong a lot. If you're going by plane, actually it reduces a lot. Counterintuitively, we think that planes are more dangerous than cars. They are definitely not. You're much more likely to have a car crash than a plane crash. And then you can think, what are the potential threats at the site? Is it water nearby? There's threat of drowning. Is there animals nearby? Is this an area that is particularly prone to crime, right? Or criminal activity? There are other people there that you cannot control their behavior. So those are all strategies you could put in place to identify the hazards. Once they're identified, very basic mitigation strategies that people very often forget, as I mentioned earlier, obviously have the number of the authorities, right? Who do you call if something happens? That reduces the damage by a lot.
Yeah.
Because, you can just ask for advice when it happens. Knowing where's the closest hospital, right? What is the number of the closest hospital if you feel that? I think that should be standard. If you live in a flood-prone area and you know there's a flood coming, you should have those numbers. What else you could think of? What about communication at the time? So the risk management strategies, universities, if you're taking students to a remote location, they would highly encourage you or maybe even force you to take a satellite phone, right? Because in a remote location, you might not get phone access and all the numbers you had, they're useless, right? You could think about, well, if it is a small thing, having a first aid kit. That reduces damages. If you have a little bruise, you could, with a first aid kit, you can clean it and isolate it. If you don't, and you're around in the bush with an open bruise, that could lead to something much worse later, right? Mm-hmm. So I think all those, and we're not talking about anything super complicated, super expensive. It's basic preparedness, right? We're not talking about becoming a doomsday prepper from today to tomorrow, but knowing your risks, knowing how you can reduce the chances of something happening, and knowing how you can reduce the damage with, these basic strategies, I think, cover many situations. And we're talking about generic situation, but people can apply to whatever they are going through.
I was also thinking, if anyone in the group has medical issues, making sure everyone knows what to do, making sure there's enough medication.
Definitely. That is certainly in the form as well of the university. You could work on the risk management, Gabriella.
I think I filled in enough of those forms.
I see. What else? Well, I think in terms of a wider community thing, very often now there are apps for early warning system. Early warning system is a whole other part of the literature, books and books written about this. It's a very valid strategy, because if people know beforehand, they can do something about it. In Australia, there's the Bureau of Meteorology app that you can look for incoming weather warnings. In Singapore, for example, there's this CG Secure app. Singapore does very active, it's very interesting as well. They do very active training on people before things happen. Sometimes I feel even a bit alarmed, but I find it fascinating how everyone in the university is trained for, in the case of a terrorist attack. And they have like, what are the steps? You're not fighting a terrorist, right? So they say, or I hope I'm not misquoting and giving wrong advice. People should look for the official, but they say, run, hide, and tell. So first thing, run away from the threat, make sure you're not found, and then call authorities or call the university and say there's something happening. So these things, they make such a big difference of knowing what you should do beforehand. The contingency plan is probably the easiest thing that people can act on. What else? I think insurance is a topic that we could cover. I don't want to go too much in that, but though I've watched, you have a podcast episode with someone, an expert in insurance. It's very interesting. Insurance, basically, they're not charity as well, an insurance company, but they are business, so they want to make a profit. But they are much better at doing risk assessments. Mm-hmm. So what they do is they assess your risks, and then they ask you to pay for that risk beforehand with a margin for their profit, obviously. So if you don't want to go through the pickle of getting after a situation, insurance is very good. Obviously, in Australia, great recommendation. Check beforehand if your insurance covers fire and flood, particularly if you live in those areas, right? I think that's a great suggestion as well for household risk management.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for all of your suggestions. I'm going to be going back to my house and saying, okay, what are the hazards that could be in my house? And also for my trip, I'm going on a trip soon, and what are the problems that I could encounter, and making sure that I've got a few things that I need to know. Number of the emergency services. So thank you so much. And if our listeners want to find out more about you, where can they find you?
So, I'm usually very active in my social media. I think you can find my handle at Erich Wolff on Twitter. Now changed the name, right? But it's still active. You can find me on LinkedIn. I think my email is always open for conversation as well, particularly if people are interested in this field, want to know more about how we deal with hazards. I think we are really excited now working with nature-based solutions, how we can work with nature to reduce disaster risk. For example, trees that can provide us refreshment from sun, from heat waves, or wetlands that can mitigate floods. Those are the things that I've been working right now. So if anyone wants to discuss these topics, I would be delighted.
Great, thank you so much. And if people, want to find those links, you can find them in the show notes. Thank you so much for talking with me today.
Thank you, Gabriella.
You've been listening to On the House, produced by the Household Management Science Labs, a division of LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. More episodes like this from across 10 life management perspectives can be found by searching LMSL on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, and other podcasting apps available on your smart devices. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider rating our show, sharing it, and subscribing to our channel, as it helps other people find it so we can grow and bring you more quality resources. More of our work can be found on our website at hm.lmsl.net, where you can join our movement. I'm Gabriella Joustra. Thanks for tuning in.